Well, thank you for being here once again. I mentioned last time that I am just dazzled that you all come out on a Sunday afternoon and have done so faithfully. And I had a chance to talk to many of you in between classes for this or that, and we're learning a lot together, aren't we? We're moving. Someone mentioned to me this morning that, I started out this thing not knowing very much. Well, frankly, I didn't know a thing about the Reformation, and so we have dug in, we have entered in, we have had a great time. At least I have had just a wonderful time reflecting, rereading a lot of things, reading new things, and exploring this sprawling wonderful event in Christian history and the history of the Western world called the Reformation. And I hope, just a note on the beer garden, I just thought we had a blast. I thought it was just great. Thanks to Jeff and Lynn and to Jeannie and the whole team planning and working on it, all of you who contributed this. I had some questions about that one, by the way. I was just not sure. And I could tell my folks were up in heaven looking down saying, really, they didn't want me to drink beer anyway, but saying, really, beer at church? I mean, and Becky, your overview on where this whole thing began in a Benedictine monastery, right? I mean, the original brew came out of that, and then to have Andy Link's information about brewing and beer, his own joy about that whole thing, just really a wonderful time. And in addition to that, I just am convicted, believe so strongly that churches ought to be places to gather in fellowship and joy, and sharing friendship, and in this case, sharing a lot of things that evening. So it was just a beautiful moment for the church, and we thank you all who have worked on it. In terms of our schedule, by the way, Mark, our son Mark, is going to be leading next week, and I wrote somewhere in the overview thing that goes out, this is one not to miss, I think. He's been working on Hilary Mantel's wonderful books, Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies. He's lectured at the Huntington in a gathering of scholars there on the topic. It is history as fiction, or fiction presenting history. So it is a novel and a creation on her part. By the way, Hilary Mantel was in his audience, if you can imagine that, which I was just, beaming proud, and just was really wonderful. But Mark will do a terrific job next week, and I'm really looking forward to it, and I think you'll enjoy it as well. I was going to say, I hope you all had a chance to lift a toast to the Reformation on Tuesday night. What occurred to me in going through this whole last week is this is a big deal. This is a big moment in history, 500 years, to celebrate what has happened out of the Reformation, to understand more what happened in the Reformation. It is really was a big celebration moment, I think, for Protestants. We're looking at all of our failings through it all. We look at Luther and ask a lot of questions about his life and things that he said and so forth. All of that, and yet something powerful and big happened in that moment when it was launched, and it spread all across Germany, then all across Europe, then all across the world. And Tuesday night, we had a moment to say 500 years, just a wonderful thing, I think. I mentioned last time, so did you get any trick-or-treaters in the garb of Luther or anything? I mean, or the Pope, or Katharina, I suppose. I was hoping somebody would pick it up and turn into trick-or-treaters with that. But so much, by the way, online all week last week, people, weighing in some kind of way, just some terrific writing going on, reflecting tremendous sense of reflection as part of the church and a part of the Protestants. But listen, in fact, I'm going to quote from 2 or 3 of them. The Catholics are also writing seriously about the moment of 500-year celebration. And they're doing their own soul searching now. Some really good Catholic writers right now. And I put a couple on the bibliography that I handed out. I'll talk about that bibliography in a moment. I also wanted to say, Jeff, the service this morning, I hope you all had your Reformation glasses on this morning to experience not only that text out of Matthew where Matthew says, Jesus says, these folks around us are piling things on you, making you feel guilty about things, and they're hypocrites with it. They will not, and this is, of course, the issue that Luther was wrestling with as well. I think it really grounds us in the scriptures in a very terrific way this morning. We sang in Isaac Watts, one of the great hymn writers of the Reformation. This morning I sing The Mighty Power of God. And then Jeff's wonderful preaching this morning. I just thought we had the Reformation was never mentioned, but it was just a wonderful service, I think, in the spirit of the Reformation. So one other little introductory thing. Do you see my little Luther down there? I got to tell you this. There he is, in my study. All the way from Wittenberg, Germany, to my study, is my little Luther. This is apparently the hottest selling toy in all of Germany. This company, have y'all read about this? I mean, it's pretty cool. And I had it. My kids, Mark's brother, twin brother, was traveling with his wife Holly and their daughter Esme to Germany. Holly leads a group of looking at the history of psychology. She's a psych professor at APU. And anyway, so they brought this little Luther back to me, and then I'm reading this week that this is apparently really a hot item, and this company can't produce enough. They're off the shelves as soon as they come on, and so I love my little Luther. I thought maybe we'd bring it in and have him looking over. By the way, he's smiling. Some commentator wrote about it, says he's a smiling Luther. Not a grumpy Luther, but a smiling Luther, and thinking about all of what he accomplished, I suppose. So if you get a chance, I've got a little selected list of readings, other readings. I know everybody's throwing readings at you. I've got about 3 different articles that have come from online articles that you could look into. Several books that I'm recommending to you. I want to say something about one in particular. I know not all of you have this in front of you, but you can get it before you leave if you're interested. Brad Gregory, The Unintended Reformation, How a Religious Revolution Secularized Society. This is a blockbuster book, in my opinion. Becky came up after I was talking about Frank Sinatra and individualism, some of the sort of unintended consequences of the Reformation, putting a huge emphasis on individualism, which is a very good thing. Freedom of the individual, of course, is a very good thing, and yet turn to some consequences of that are not so hot. And anyway, she came up afterwards and recommended this book as a really big book, she said, and it's big, though not huge in size, but really an important book, I think. So that's one that I would recommend. But I recommend Roland Bainton's biography, Here I Stand, A Life of Martin Luther. Just has really, in my opinion, I've reread it over the course of these weeks, and it just has really held its its value, I think, as one of the really good biographies. I had a feeling going back into it, I read it in college, going back into it, that it probably was going to feel very dated to me. It doesn't. I think it's just a terrific piece of writing, very reflective. There's a book by Calvin, by the way, called A Little Book on Christian Life. If you want to dip deeper into Calvin and his own writings, this is it's called a little book, and it is historically it's been that. It's called a golden book too. At one point, it's got about 3 chapters out of the Institutes that have been republished in a little, and it's been going on for for maybe 500 years. I mean, it was a long time ago that it got started that way. The Institutes are, I think, 4 volumes, 80 chapters, and these are 3 or 4 chapters out of the Institutes called. Talking about on Calvin's perspective on how to live the Christian life. So that's a good access into Calvin, I think. Eric Metaxas' Martin Luther, which I have not read, begun dipping into it, but The Man Who Rediscovered God and Changed the World is a new biography that is just out just this last week, and so brand new. Anyway, these are some just terrific readings on there for you to think about as you continue your own reflections on this this amazing movement, this amazing historical moment, but in addition to that, a moment that continues to inform the church today, the broad church today continues to inform our lives, of course, in this church and our lives individually. Well, let's dive into this extraordinary moment one more time. In case your heads are swimming over the kind of unruliness of this whole thing called the Reformation, and in case you have not quite pinned down in your own mind what really caused the Reformation, or what some of its consequences are, which we began talking about last time, or perhaps where we go from here, I want to take a stab at all of those things tonight. So buckle up. I'm very excited about what we've got to present here and think about together, and hope that you will be on board with me as well. So let me begin by saying, in the spirit of full disclosure, I want to start by talking about some of the choices and biases that I have made to present the Reformation, really those choices that I've made for my own mind in order to get my head around it, my heart around the Reformation. There's so much that could be done, so much we could have done, but you've got to have some focus, and I want to share with you the choices that I have made by way of introducing our discussion tonight. Where I want to go before we end today is to get at understanding what I think is the heart of the Reformation, and that's grace. I want to talk about grace. I want to reflect together on what grace is. I think this is the heart of the matter. And but as we aim towards getting there, let's think about what these other possibilities are that we could have been looking at. So the first thing that has been a choice I have made is to focus on Luther. This is for myself, by the way, as well as whatever I've been presenting here, is to focus on Luther. I am convinced that Martin Luther is the one who first touched a live nerve that unleashed this whole thing. There are lots of ways of looking at that moment when he made his great discovery. That it's not about my working towards my faith. It's not about me working to gain entrance into the presence of a holy God. I am forgiven already. I don't have to earn my way. I am forgiven already. I am deemed righteous by God already. All I have to do is believe that. That's what I think is the heart of the matter, the beginning, the nerve that he touched and then therefore released an energy, explosive energy. What you have got to think at that, when you think about that, is the time was absolutely ripe and ready for him to announce the discovery of grace. In other words, people were hurting in terms of feeling and access into God's presence. They were hurting, feeling like the church even was creating some of that separation rather than contributing to it, right? I mean, it seems to me that when you talk about it in terms of the nerve that Luther touched and released this energy, it means that people in the streets, people in the churches, people in their homes were feeling a great need to rediscover God's lavish love, right? I mean, I think and that's the rediscovery that I think is available to all of us, and why we would look at this and why we would read the same scriptures in order to rediscover God's lavishly loving God that loves us. I want to read this line again. This is what I was presenting at the sort of epicenter. This is it. He touched the live nerve that changed the world, and this is where he made that discovery in the tower experience. You remember that? He was in the tower of his monastery in his study, studying Romans, and all of a sudden he comes to this discovery. Yet I clung to the dear Paul and had a great yearning to know what he meant. And then I grasped, I'm really cutting down that passage, we looked at it more at length the last time, but then I grasped that the justice of God is that righteousness by which through grace and sheer mercy God justifies us through faith. It's got all of the components of the Reformation are in that line. It is grace. It is, by the way, it is the discovery through Scripture to begin with, sola scriptura, okay? But then it is grace, sola gratia, and sola fide. It is through faith that we accept the grace that God gives us, that God loves us. In His sheer mercy, He justifies us. He makes us right. We are made whole. We can claim in our struggles to accept ourselves, to accept the way things are, what we come to in these moments of grace, which need to be renewed practically on a daily basis. Yes, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, the discovery of grace renewed over and over. So my focus has been on Luther. This discovery, this, it seems to me, is the launching point for the Reformation. I know there was a lot more that was going on all around it, but in some ways, if there's a trigger moment, a launching of the whole thing, it comes in this discovery, and this is the discovery of Paul's notion of grace that we accept through faith and not by working towards it, right? Okay, so that's the other big deal about the whole center of it. Not that we have to work towards it and earn it and do all of these things. Remember, I quoted Luther before. He said, if anybody deserved to go to heaven for his monkishness, it was me. I mean, him. He was working at it as a monk, trying to be a very faithful and good monk. Now remember, okay, so we've got Luther in this moment. We've got this epicenter of discovery of grace. We've got this nerve that he touches when he announces all of this, begins to preach out of it. Not just the 95 Theses, by the way. Remember that. That's, at least my claim is, that's not really where it was. That was thought that came after the discovery of grace. And then he's challenging the church, like, you're standing in the way. You're getting in our way. You're putting up obstacles. You're trying to make us earn something that we don't have to earn. It's already given to us through grace. So it's not the 95 Thesis, it's this, but remember, so much more going on. A rich and wonderful and exciting and intriguing historical moment in the Western world as the Middle Ages began to come to a close. And the great Renaissance was launched in this very, very moment with all of the artistic creativity in art and literature and architecture, all of this coming at that very moment, right in those moments, a little later than Luther, but right in this moment, the Renaissance is launched. There are cultural and philosophical happenings, the reflections that are going on by scholars of the day. Humanism is something that grew out of this, a focus on human reason. Eventually, by the way, evolving into the Enlightenment, which we call the age of reason and science and so forth. All of this was churning in the history right at the time of Luther. This was a time of the birth of individualism. We talked about that before. And Luther, of course, gives a church reading of that, a biblical reading of individualism, that we are all priests, that we're all a part of understanding the Scriptures on our own. We can study and understand the Scriptures on it. We don't have to go through a mediator to do this. This is an emphasis that he put on individual. We celebrate that, and yet, of course, the unintended consequences of that we have to think about. And then there is, of course, the challenge of authority. He was a figure in that whole challenge of authority, but of course everybody was challenging authority eventually out of this rich period of history. But he certainly puts his finger on that in the church very explicitly and very directly, challenging the authority of the Pope, challenging the authority of the church, and things began to crumble. Authority began to crumble. And individuals began to rise, and all of this was this great historical moment that we reflect on. So that all was there. It was an earth-shaking time in history, an upheaval. But Luther is the one who zeroed in as a theologian, as a reader of Scripture, as a monk, as, by the way, a faithful member of the church when he began. And he zeroed in the midst of all of this going on around him, he zeroed in and made the statements that he made that caused the religious Reformation of the church and turned things upside down. So I put my emphasis on Luther. And I've had to make some choices. We all have to make some choices about how to deal with this. There are some other things we could have looked at and probably should have. And the first one is Calvin. I'm not an expert on Calvin at all, and yet he clearly is among the great reformers, along with Luther, considered just the towering figure, this brilliant thinker from France. A lawyer, trained as a lawyer, moved eventually to Geneva, and tried there, by the way, with the authorities within the community to establish a city that would be guided by a biblical thought, of course, but Reformation thought, to build a Reformation city. Could this thing, really carry out in terms of the way we handle government and so forth? And Calvin was highly influential, and of course, very important to our tradition as Presbyterians and in this church. I confess that I should like Calvin more than I do. And I'm sorry to all of my pastor friends, and you need to teach me more. I get I get a bit of guilt theology coming out of Calvin that I have spent my life trying to overcome, to not feel guilty all the time. You read Calvin and he tends to slip off into, he's presenting to you the same explosive sense of individual freedom and so forth, but he tends to slip off into the shoulds that I've had to work with all my life. But anyway, that's terrible in this place to say it, but that's where I am, and that's why I probably didn't put such an emphasis on Calvin. Some of the rest of you have to correct that, but we could have looked, by the way, at the English Reformation. Mark's going to do that next week. That messy, difficult, intriguing whole thing where Henry VIII decided that he wanted to get an annulment for his marriage so that he could have another marriage. He ended up having 6 of them. But he asked the Pope to annul his marriage, and the Pope said no. And so then so the Reformation was in the air, and he decided to take England in the direction of the Reformation. I'm forgetting my slideshow here. There's Calvin. I don't know whether that's very fair or not, but it's kind of grim, isn't it? That's Calvin. And then there is Henry VIII here in all of his magnificence, and who, as we say there, demanded this annulment, thought that this was not a big problem, and the Pope decided that it was a problem. It was a violation of church teaching and would not allow it. And then I wanted to mention the Book of Common Prayer that came out of the English Reformation. This is a magnificent document, a magnificent thing. It was a Reformation document to begin with. And then Queen Mary, of course, pulled it back when she declared the country to move back to the Catholic Church. But then after she was displaced, a revised version, which was even more reformed, and that had the touch of the great Thomas Cranmer, then Archbishop of Canterbury. In 1552, they reissued the Book of Common Prayer, and so much of this endures in this marvelous book, leading the church in its practices, in its ceremonies, in its ritual, in its liturgies, and also reflecting on the scriptures and so forth. It is the text of this book. Is an enduring text. Well, we could have focused on the English Reformation. We could have also focused on American Protestantism, which is also a very fascinating thing, much of it informed by Calvinism, by the way. The early Puritans were true believers in Calvin's angle on Reformed thought. And by the way, in the series that's coming to the Huntington, there's a speaker there named David Hall. Our son Mark has gotten to know him. If you get a chance to hear David Hall, he's got a rereading of the Puritans that I think is just really brilliant. It is very, but saying that they get a bad rap, and it's really too bad that they were much more decent people than they're portrayed to be. But in any case, we could have looked at the Puritans. So much rich stuff going on there. There was John Winthrop, one of the leading Puritans who came to the New World in 1630, and I want to read this passage. There's the Mayflower and the Puritans, and then this Winthrop passage. You all have heard this at some point, but it's quite magnificent. This is Winthrop in 1630 now, coming to American shores, talking and thinking about what it means to be starting a new society. Was God going with them, and what should they do, and how should they do it? And he says, "For we must consider that we shall be a city on a hill, A city upon a hill. I can't believe how many presidents, if you go just Google city on a hill, you'll see how many presidents have used that language, that we are a city on a hill, a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants, and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us, till we will be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. So this notion that they were doing something extraordinary, taking the gospel to new lands, very much a risky venture that they were taking, believing very much that they could form their own community. So they were escaping persecution, no question about it, but form their own community. How should we do that? How can we be a Christian community? How can we be a light for all of the world? How can we be a city upon a hill, shining the light of the gospel? They were serious about all of that. By the way, Winthrop, prior to this famous passage, he has an extraordinary passage on learning how to love and care for one another. We sometimes, even in the conversation we had last time, talk about the individualism that comes out of the Reformation, and that creates some separation among us. We don't do community very well. We splinter. We get upset with a church, and we go find another church. We go found another church. But Winthrop has this gorgeous passage, just beautiful, saying, come together, care for one another. This is what we will be known for. This is what we must do as Christians. We must be able to love one another. So anyway, there's John Winthrop. We could have looked on the American Reformation. I also want to mention Anne Bradstreet. I think, Becky, you mentioned Anne Bradstreet in your mention of women in the Reformation. She was a member of Winthrop's crew that came to America in 1630. And she really was a very remarkable woman. We could have studied Anne Bradstreet. That would have been a kick. That would have been really, really rewarding, I think. She was a writer. When a woman writing, and as she says in this little passage I want to read, a woman writing poetry especially was not looked up at, was not very honored. And yet Anne Bradstreet, she's feisty in this passage that I'm going to read here. She's got a feisty spirit about her. But she is perhaps America's first poet, a woman. She is among the great poets in all of American history. She's a very fascinating person. But listen to this line she has. This one's off-quoted, and it doesn't represent her whole picture, but it's pretty interesting. I am obnoxious to each carping tongue. I am obnoxious to each carping tongue, who says my hand a needle better fits. A poet's pen all scorn I should thus wrong, for such despite they cast on female wits. Isn't that nice? That's a nice spirit. She's pushing back on folks that say, you're writing poetry? I mean, just take care of the kids. And she's saying no, and she had 8 kids, by the way, and so she was taking care of the kids, but indeed she had a spirit that was strong, and she was working out her faith through the writing that she was doing and communicating this, and we have the privilege of reading it. So, okay, and later there's Jonathan Edwards, one of the great 18th century preachers, philosophers, famous, by the way, for his Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Let's get Winthrop up there. But so much more. He was really the shaping influence around the First Great Awakening, which was a great revival that happened within within the American society as it was growing and shaping itself, and he led this wonderful revival, powerful revival that swept the country. So then also we could have focused on John Knox, who was in the 16th century was a founder of the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. And he, along with so many of them, like Calvin, for example, bounced around with a lot of the political turmoil going on, but ended up in Scotland. And John Knox is a part of what we claim. We were in this heritage. This is where our bagpipes come from, by the way. It's from this Scottish heritage that we have through John Knox. We could have focused on Knox. Then let me also mention the Wesleys, John and Charles Wesley. John was the preacher, Charles mostly the hymn writer, written so many of our great hymns. We sang "And Can It Be" last time, and such wonderful stuff that came from these two. John Wesley believed, he was an Anglican, he was British, he believed that the church had gone too stodgy, too elitist, and felt like that the church was not serving the poor, and he took the gospel to the streets, literally. I mean, he went around preaching. That's where we get the notion of the itinerant preacher, by the way. He traveled around preaching in the streets. He was a fiery preacher, a wonderful preacher, and a great writer. Very thoughtful, coming out of what the Wesleys, of course, is Methodism. Part of Methodism, by the way, which they founded, they never founded the movement, by the way, but it grew out of that. By the way, moved to America, became a very strong movement on American soil as well. But the important movement of the holiness tradition came out of the teachings of John Wesley. And then lastly is what we could have done. There is Abraham Kuyper, who late in the late, I bring up Abraham Kuyper in tribute to my friend Rich Mao, who was longtime president at Fuller here in town, who is a big Kuyper follower. He will preach Kuyper wherever he goes and whatever he does. I think I put Rich's book on that bibliography that he's written a book on Abraham Kuyper. It's a personal reflection or something like that is the subtitle of the book. And but anyway, Abraham Kuyper, I think, is a wonderful reformer in the 19th century, late 19th century, talking about Christian cultural engagement with a secular culture. And he's got much to teach us, and that, of course, is a theme that Rich is always big on, as I am as well. So anyway, okay, enough of all of that kind of overview or survey. Those are things that are yet to be done, but I have put an emphasis on Luther as we have gone through instead of all of these others. There's a lot that they share in common, and yet, as you know about the Reformation, there's a lot that's very distinctive about each one of these. And that is a part, I think, of the intrigue and the interest that we continue to have about the Reformation. But I find Luther, broken human being as he was, I find him even today stimulating, challenging in his thinking, relevant to my own life. I think some of his thinking, the struggles that he was going through, are struggles that we continue to move through in our own Christian lives, in our own society. As a writer, he can be crude, though almost always brilliant. He's rough-edged. There's no question about it. He can be a formidable debater. But he often shows his opponents as not his intellectual equal. He is pretty amazing, pretty amazing. His readings of the Scripture can be informative and I think scintillating. He took stands that were anti-Semitic, by the way. A lot of that is coming up, and reflections about Luther. he was very favorable, by the way, and very open towards the Jews in the earlier part of his life when he grew into his feisty and sometimes brittle later years. He made some statements that are simply not acceptable. I mean, they just really were off base in terms of an openness towards the Jews, and it was not something uncommon in the context of the culture in which he was operating, but it is definitely there and something we have to deal with and ask forgiveness for him and for any influence he may have had on a German culture beyond that. But nevertheless, Luther is a seminal, towering figure of the Reformation. You know, not just because he took a courageous stance towards the Catholic Church, not just that, but though he was, through his truly deeply thoughtful writing and thinking, he lasts. So, let's start on this. Where I want to go now is to really focus on a couple of other matters, but then when I, in terms of what we could have done and why we have chosen to make this focus, let me say this, that some scholars and thinkers have tried to read the Reformation as political, social, economic, cultural alone. And that's not the way I read it. I think it is primarily spiritual, personal, theological. I think the heart of the matter is personal, theological, and spiritual, and not in some of these other ways. There was a Catholic writer this last week who put out a piece, and he said, put simply, the Reformation was as much a political revolt as it was ever a theological movement. Political expediency among many of the princes in the Holy Roman Empire made the embrace of a revolt by reformers against the prevailing social order, politically and economically advantageous. I just don't buy it that was the real driver. I know it was there, and I know a lot of people talk about it. I think it was religious. You know, one of the things that we have to remember here, there's John Wesley. I'm not keeping up with my slides, I'm sorry. One of the things that we have to remember here is that people were religious. We have moved through a time, this is Charles Taylor, who has written a really monumental book called A Secular Age, tracing this, I put it on the bibliography, by the way, if you want to read this, it's tracing this movement that came from a time when the presumption of belief ruled the culture. Everybody believed. They believed in God. They believed that God was a part of their lives, that God was a part of history. We've got to go, we can't even fathom that in living in our secular age. I mean, where we have come, Charles Taylor says it this way: from a society in which it was virtually impossible not to believe in God, we have come now to one in which faith, even for the staunchest believers, you and me, is one human possibility among others. That's an incredible statement. This turning point in history. And what I want to say about that is that in emphasizing the religious nature of the Reformation, we must remember that people were religious. I mean, good night. They were. We are not, as a society, as a broader secular culture. We simply are not. We know that. We feel it every day. But at some point that change happened, and this was the moment, by the way, in history when it did take place. But that's what emphasizes my bias, at least, to look at this as a religious movement. There is a lot that we could say, by the way, about all of the unintended consequences of the Reformation. I mentioned the book that Becky had recommended to me, The Unintended Reformation, How a Religious Revolution Secularized Society. And it did launch the secularizing of our society. It did. This was a part of what happened, the outgrowth of what happened out of the Reformation. I read a fabulous article by George Weigel. I don't know any of you know George Weigel. He's a friend of mine, by the way. I call him a Catholic intellectual. He's lay. He's not in the priesthood, but he writes on all matters Catholic. He wrote a terrific article in First Things this last week. But he talks about this book, Gregory's book. And he says, and Gregory has the argument, among the things the Reformation, in this case the various Protestant Reformations, bequeathed the modern world were hyper-individualism, suspicion of all authority, moral subjectivism and relativism, skepticism about the truth of anything, the banishment of religious thought from Western academic life, and the reduction of all true knowledge to what we can know from science. Wow, that's a list. The unintended consequences, that's a list. Huge. That's a broad indictment, to be sure, says Weigel. But amidst Gregory's dense prose and complex presentation, serious readers will get a glimpse of how bad ideas can play themselves out in history with devastating results. So we've got to look, as each of us takes hold of the Reformation, thinks about it in terms of our own lives in our own church, our own, the outgrowth of the Reformation, the influence of the Reformation. We've got to take a look and confess boldly, honestly, that there were unintended consequences that have caused a great deal of problems for us. But having said that, I simply can't rest there and say that's the end of the story, because I believe the Reformation lives today in very, very positive kinds of ways. So here's the question I want to think about, and what the time left, and we'll take a break here right now. But did the Reformers see the unintended consequences coming? Of course they didn't. They lived, as we all do, in the context of an unfolding history. They operated on the basis of the best thinking they had to offer, right? They knew things were not right in the church. There was indeed corruption. Most of all, people seemed overwhelmed by their own shortcomings with no way out. People felt separated from a righteous, holy God, and the church didn't seem to help. And so they had to speak up. That was shameful, unbiblical. Luther concluded in this bolt of lightning that he received in the tower in a monastery. That was not the role of the church. And so he spoke up and said there must be something more. And that's when we get at the true heart of the Reformation. So let's take a break. Stand up and move around and for about 5 or 7 minutes or something, and then we'll come back and we'll zero in on this heart of the matter. I've got to share with you this picture. This was in the New York Times last week. By a wonderful writer, Catholic writer, Ross Douthat. I don't know any of you who may read him. No, I didn't put this one on the bibliography, but anyway, this is Luther in Hell. This is an actual picture, by the way, a painting. What is, I put the dates on there, something, I can't see it. It's, so the painter was 1676 to 1744, so somewhere in there. This is Luther in Hell, and this is a part of the counter-Reformation, you might call it. And Douthat says, as we're thinking about this whole Reformation, especially from a Catholic perspective, he's a Catholic now, remember, as we're thinking about this whole thing, in official ecclesiastical circles, the rule is to speak of the Reformation in regretful tones. Now, this is a Catholic saying this, okay. Like children following a bad divorce who hope that that many years have passed, the divided family can come together for a holiday or at least an ecumenical communion service, right? So, well, you didn't think that was quite as funny as I did. I thought it was just hilarious. I'm not taking that picture seriously, but it is out there. It was out there, of course, at the resistance to all of what Luther was all about. So let's, this is back to George Weigel's article, and I want to say something about this. What I want to do now, I may have tried to cover way too much material in the first part, but we're going to zero in now for the rest of the time on what I call the heart of the matter, and that's grace. What is it that the Reformation is really about? And I want to say ultimately, what is it about for me? It becomes very personal to me because this notion of grace. I have spent all of my life trying to believe in grace, and I want to say what that means. But look at George Weigel's comment here. He's also a Catholic, by the way, writing in First Things, but he says, the 500th anniversary of one of the emblematic acts in this cultural tsunami of reformations should lead to a deepening ecumenical dialogue about what these many early modern reformers wrought, and not just for the world, but primarily for the church. Now, again, there's some soul searching going on here. As I've been looking at the Catholic writers throughout this last week and weeks that they've been reflecting, there is soul searching going on still, 500 years later. What did the church do wrong? Was the split a good one? What do the reformers have to say? And this is what Weigel is reflecting on. He goes on to say that true ecclesial reform, and this is what I want to focus on, is thus always reform. It is not something we make up by our own cleverness. It does not mean surrender to a spirit of the age. It does not involve substituting our judgment for God's revelation. True Christian reform always involves bringing into the present something the church has laid aside or misplaced. That is a great line about what caused the Reformation, what Luther had his finger on, what the reformers all were objecting to, the church, and this is a little bit of a defensive note here on Weigel's part, saying that the church really was not living up to its own preaching and its own convictions, right? So true reform, true Christian reform always involves bringing into the present something the church has laid aside or misplaced, and making that Christ-given something into an instrument for renewal. I love that. And I think that's, if we look at this whole sweeping reality of the Reformation and all of its various forms and all that was going on, what I think is being said here, that the church had laid aside or misplaced something vital to its own teaching, something vital to biblical teaching, something vital to what the gospel is all about, and that's grace. I mean, by the way, I read that first little passage from Weigel to say, yes, and also we are now in an ecumenical discussion about what that center is, and I think we should be in an ecumenical discussion across all of our denominational split, 33,000 denominations in Protestantism, my word. The split that has happened with the Catholic Church, we need to be in ecumenical discussion about what is central to it all, right? That's what I think the focus needs to be. That's where we need to focus in our own lives, our own church, where the way we relate to the Catholic Church, and so on. So I've been thinking a lot about this. What is that center? What is it that the church has misplaced? What is it that the church has misplaced any point along the way? Any church will die if it misplaces the center, the heart of the matter. Any church will wither and dwindle. It will decline if the emphasis is not at that core that has been misplaced, that is a part of the teaching of the church, that has forever been, that is a part of the gospel, that is a part of the biblical teaching of the gospel. We must reclaim that. We must be about Reformation on and on, right? Forever. And this is what even Weigel, the Catholic intellectual of today, looks back and say, this is what the Reformers were trying to do, was to reclaim what had been misplaced, what had been abused, what had been let go by the church. Let's reclaim that. And I think that reclaiming, I think that core is grace. So let's talk about grace. What's so revolutionary about grace? Why is it that the discovery of a God who was lavishly loving towards individuals, why was that so explosive? Let's think about that. That's where the bombshell was that set it all off. So what about grace? I have often said that I have spent my whole adult life trying to believe in grace. I think that's what every Christian does. It's a grace that I know is promised to me, but I don't always claim it. I always feel my mother's wagging finger that you haven't done enough. Right? My mother was a beautiful person. I told my brother I was going to talk about our mother, and I said, please trust me, I will not say negative things about my mother, our mother, because she was a beautiful person. She was an artist in the kitchen. It was her gift, and she gave that gift to our family, for which I am forever grateful, of course. She gave that gift to the community, to her church, to others. She brought the gift of food, and so I am so thankful for her. But she learned Calvinist teaching in our church, and she never believed in herself enough. She never accepted grace, that she was accepted, that she was loved by a loving God, and of course she passed that on to her children. And I always have this image of the finger wagging somehow that you've not quite done enough. Do you know the feeling? I happen to believe it's a universal feeling. I think some of you are far more healthy than I am, though, and you may have escaped it, but I think it's pretty universal. And I think this is the feeling that Luther had his finger on, saying, everybody feels this. He was certainly going through it. Trying to be a good monk, trying to be a good Christian, trying to be a good Catholic, trying to measure up to the demands of the church, to the demands of God as he saw it, to a righteous God, by the way, who knew justice, and he knew that he deserved the justice of God to come down hard on him because he didn't measure up. This is the tape I think we've all got in our heads somehow. It's a tremendous irony to me. Here we were, a good Christian family, a good Calvinist family, by the way, good Reformed Christians, and yet we had within that family this inability to fully accept ourselves. Now listen, let me change the language a little so that it might really ring true to you. It was a fine article in Christianity Today online, this reprinted. It was written a couple of years ago, but reprinted this last week by a guy named David Zoll, whom I do not know, but the article is 500 years after Luther, we still feel the pressure to be justified. Here's a paragraph from this article. Listen to this. A few years ago, in response to a spate of suicides on its campuses, the University of Pennsylvania put together a task force to explore the mental health of students. What they found was tragic, but sadly unsurprising. The pressure engendered, this is from the report, the pressure engendered by the perception that one has to be perfect in every academic, co-curricular, and social endeavor can lead to stress and in some cases distress. The task force had reported this. In turn, distress can manifest as demoralization, alienation, or conditions like anxiety or depression. For some students, mental illness can lead to suicide. Tragic, sad, but the same theme running within our culture for young people, feeling that they must be perfect, they must measure up, they must work harder. Get the right scores, get into the right schools. All of this is a part of our own self-understanding, and this is not grace. We need grace, don't we? David Zoll goes on with another kind of example. He says, take busyness, our own story of busyness. We're all busy. When asked how we're doing, we used to say fine or well. Today, as a number of commentators have noted, the default response is busy. I'm busy. It's a positive thing, by the way. It's supposed to be. Right? I mean, it's supposed to be a positive projection that, I'm busy, I'm important. Therefore, I'm important. I'm busy. I got a lot of things going on. I do it. You do it. And we're not lying. Smartphones and similar devices have largely chased away the uncomfortable idleness that once characterized society, quickening the pace of life to an almost absurd degree. But busyness is more than a description of how we're doing. It's one of our culture's predominant indicators of worth and value, a measure of personal righteousness. The more frantic the activity, the better. The implication is that we're not over-occupied, we are inferior to those who are. As with all law-based barometers of self-worth, beauty, wealth, influence, youth, etc., there is no enough. I have a good friend, by the way. I'm not going to put his picture on here. I need to make sure that I'm not skipping a slide here. I've got a good friend who's wonderful. He's a dear friend of mine. There would be no possible way I'd mention his name here. He's a very successful leader, a very successful professional, wonderful guy. Anyway, I just love him, but he's always busy. And you ask him, and he's always busy. How are you doing? Oh, I'm just so busy. I got to catch a plane tomorrow morning, and I'm out tonight, and whatever. The whole story. We all do this, don't we? And the point is, it's a signal that we don't quite believe we're okay, right? Finally, from this writer, the pressure to reform, he says, to perform, to make something of oneself, to become acceptable, to make a difference in the world, to justify one's existence. It's a phenomenon that cannot help but reinvigorate narcissism, throws us back on ourselves, and when we falter in some irreversible way, we inevitably view self-harm as an option. So this is where Luther began too. He looked at the law, God's law, and said, do I measure up? I don't measure up. Will I ever measure up? I'll never measure up. And he was obsessed by this. They said that he went to confession several times a day. And the confessor priest, he got irritated with him. He's picky about things, picky about what he needs to confess. All of that. And so this syndrome just fit him to a T. But what I want to suggest is that we all live with it, don't we? I think it's human nature somehow. We could think a long time about what that human nature is, but we simply feel we don't measure up quite. And we put that on others. We put it on our children. There's a lot contained in it about conditional love. I mean, I love you, but you need to do this or that in order for me really to love you. It's conditional. And it's felt conditional as we put that on other people. Well, wouldn't it be nice to feel God's lavish love through His grace and mercy? To really feel it. To be transformed by it, to be changed by it. This is when Luther, in a great passage, he says, I felt born again. I felt like a brand new person. When I discovered grace, when all of a sudden the light went on that grace is mine through faith. All I have to do is believe it. To be able to let go of all of this self-talk about needing to do something more in order to be accepted. Wouldn't it be great to finally really feel transformed by grace? I want to read a passage from Paul Tillich that has been really important to me. Paul Tillich was a theologian, a thinker in the mid 20th century, quite left-wing in his politics, in his view on things, but really marvelous in some of his insights. He's written a book called The Shaking of the Foundations. He's not written the book. It's a series of his sermons that he gave in New York City in the 1940s. And his sermons were basically aimed at professionals who would come into the church. It was at Union Theological Seminary. And they would come into the church skeptics. He was sort of saying, I know you don't get all of this stuff, so I'm teaching these classes at high levels of theological reflection and so forth, but I want to tell you what it really is all about. This is what the gospel is all about. And in this particular sermon, he talks about grace. He talks about being struck by grace. Do we know what it means to be struck by grace? I'd love for you to ask that question of yourself. Have you ever felt this? We cannot, he says, transform our lives unless we allow them to be transformed by that stroke of grace. This is pure Luther. I mean, this is pure Luther. This is pure Reformed thought. Tillich says, grace strikes us when we are in great pain and restlessness. It strikes us when we walk through the dark valley of a meaningless and empty life. It strikes us when we feel that our separation is deeper than usual because we have violated another life, a life which we loved, or from which we are estranged. It strikes us when our disgust for our own being, our indifference, our weakness, our hostility, and our lack of direction and composure have become intolerable to us. It strikes us when year after year the longed-for perfection of life does not appear, when the old compulsions reign within us as they have for decades, when despair destroys all joy and courage. That's when grace comes. Requires of us an honesty about ourselves that we're, in those moments when we're feeling that kind of emptiness, that we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and to be open and to confess, really. It is a confession that we are separate from God and that we are in need of something more. Well, here's the answer to this angst of the human spirit. This is Tillich again. And again, I believe it's just pure Reformation grace. Sometimes at that moment, when we are down in those places, a wave of light breaks into our darkness. And it is as though a voice were saying, you are accepted, accepted by that which is greater than you. Isn't that a great line? Aren't those the great moments in life when we get to the point of really feeling it, that you are accepted? by someone much greater than you. Do not ask the name right now. Perhaps you will find it later. Remember his audience here now. These are a group of skeptics and so forth. Do not try to do anything now. Perhaps later you will do much. Do not seek for anything. Do not perform anything. Do not intend anything. Simply accept the fact that you are accepted. If that happens to us, we experience grace. Right? Isn't that great? And I wonder if it happens to us, if we really, truly feel accepted, that's when we experience grace. After such an experience, we may not do better than before, and we may not believe more than before, but everything is transformed. In that moment, grace conquers sin, and reconciliation bridges the gulf of estrangement from God and from others. And nothing is demanded of this experience. No religious or moral or intellectual presupposition, nothing but acceptance. Well, I'm convinced that, this is the grace. This is the grace that we all long for, we yearn for. This is the grace promised to us, but we don't always claim it. We don't always see it. We don't always believe it by faith, right? That's what it takes. It takes believing it by faith that the God of grace is there with us and that we are in fact accepted. We are accepted. We are accepted. Along with my journey in life, trying to discover grace, trying to accept grace, I've come to a place where I can smell guilt theology a mile away. I walk into a church and I can feel it. It's not our church, by the way. I can hear guilt theology preaching in a second. I think we all can. And that's not the preaching we hear in our church, Jeff, not by any means. It's grace preaching. It is grace-filled preaching. It is a grace-filled church, and it must be a grace-filled church or it will decline. I think the guilt-filled churches are not living up to the gospel. Right? There's a lot of it. We all know it, don't we? I mean, it's negative. It's not positive. It draws you down. It drags you down. You walk out feeling bad, feeling worse than when you came in. You say, it's really true. This is what the Reformation wanted to teach. This is what, by the way, as we keep saying all along, Luther discovered that the Catholic Church of his moment was standing in the way of receiving this grace, of understanding this grace, was putting up obstacles, was saying you got to pay for it with the penances. You got to pay for it and then you may make some progress. This is what exactly Luther saw as a problem in the church, and this is exactly, it seems to me, what we must see in our own moment in time in our own churches. Otherwise, we will decline. The church will decline. The church is declining in numbers, by the way. A tragic thing for us, something we've got to get our hearts around and our heads around and say, no, it ain't going to happen here. We offer grace. We offer God's lavish love to everyone that walks in these doors. That's what the Reformation Church is all about. I believe it's also what the Catholic Church is all about, but also looking back in history, it was a moment in time when they were putting up obstacles. So that's it. So that's the Reformation. In my opinion, that's the heart of the matter. So much to say there. I understand, huge books are being written, look at them. I mean, they're just everybody talking about. But ultimately, it seems to me that it comes down to grace offered to each one of us, to you and me. Grace by a lavishly loving God. Grace by a merciful God through Jesus Christ, who welcomes us into his arms, who loves us, point at which we feel accepted, made whole again, and given a sense of wholeness. We don't have to wrestle with all of this. I'd love to stop saying I'm busy. Because it really does tip off that you're kind of working towards getting an image that people will accept, and you just accept yourself. God loves you. It's okay. Stop it. God loves you. I know my mother's cheering from heaven right now. I think she got the other side too, and I don't want to leave the notion that she probably didn't. Well, let me finish with just a few thoughts. Kind of some concluding reflections as I finish my time. I may participate a little bit in what Mark is doing next week, but mostly that will be his session. So what then do we make of the Reformation? I've got about 5 or 6 things. First, as we've talked about it, it's all about grace. It's not about doing good works. And I think that's the case. That's what we've been talking about. It's all about grace. The focus is on grace. There are the 5 solas, but of course grace is there. Faith is linked to that. I always put the 2 of them together. And of course the scriptures are there. And the scriptures are the place where we discover the story of grace. So it feels to me that it's worth saying that it is all about grace. By the way, there is some misconception, it seems to me, in Reformation thinking, and as we look on the Reformers, that the whole notion was that so that we would get in heaven, we would go to heaven. I actually don't find that in the Reformers' reflection. Of course, they believed in heaven. In eternal life. Of course they did. But it was not that we wanted that we do the good works to begin with to get in heaven, or that we accept this grace in order to get into heaven, but that we would live flourishing lives, for goodness sakes. I think that's what they talk about an awful lot, is this is the way to lead and to live flourishing lives. This is heaven on earth. That's the way they would be thinking about it. So anyway, first thing is it's all about grace. Second thing, it's all about the Holy Scriptures, absolutely the central practice of our journey of faith. There's a lot of research going on these days. Christian Smith from Notre Dame, whom I know, I've invited him as a speaker, just sent me into great conviction about what we were doing with college students. But there is a basic biblical illiteracy among young people today. They don't know the Bible. So, sorry to be a negative message, but this is the research that's demonstrating. And by the way, our son Mike made a documentary of Christian Smith and the whole. It's called Soul Searching. That's the name of the book, and that's the name of the documentary too. But it's the interviewing these young people, and they're talking about their religious experience, and they simply don't know the Bible. I mean, they don't know anything about it. It's basic biblical illiteracy. And I got to tell you, we have got to set the example that we are not the ones who model illiteracy or disrespect or not knowing the Scriptures. In my opinion, the Reformers got it right. The Scriptures need to be at the center of everything. It is the introduction of Christ, ultimately. This is where we get the story of the teachings, the death, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is the center of it. And we must reclaim the Scriptures. Those churches that do, I love, by the way, that every week in our bulletin, the text of the day is printed. And we can read it, we can listen to the good reading of our pastors, but at the same time we can read it. The center of the liturgy is in the Scriptures, and I think that's a must for thriving churches. It is the Reformed way. It is to reclaim, is to understand, of course, the Scriptures. I read that quote the first time I talked about Luther memorizing Romans. It's always mind-boggling to me when I think about it. Here's what he said. He memorized the whole book so he could cite it and think about it and reflect it daily. And I think the practice of reading Scripture must be a daily practice. Do we all keep it up? No, we don't. Do I keep it up? I don't. But I have made a huge effort that is a daily part of my life. My Christian life is to read the Scriptures. I've been reading a psalm every day for about 3 years now, 3 or 4 years. A great way to begin. Read something else in the Scriptures, but a great way to begin. The practice, actually, central, the Reformers said, to the whole Christian life. The third thing, learning to say what we believe against the grain of hostile culture. My new book that's coming out is, the subtitle is, How Do We Say, Saying What We Believe in an Age of Unbelief. We live in an age of unbelief. We live in a secular society. How do we talk about our faith? Well, the Reformers model for us. They're a model. They stand up and speak. They all do. They write. They use language. I know we've got to live our lives. I hate that line that's attributed to St. Francis, by the way. It's probably he never said it. But it is, preach the gospel every day and sometimes use words. I don't like that. I think, I get it. You're supposed to live your Christian life. You're supposed to live like Christians. You're supposed to, absolutely, I get all of that. But you got to say it. That's a challenge for us. We are inarticulate as well as biblically illiterate at times, and I think the Reformers showed us a way that we need to stand up and say what we believe. Another thing, teach us to pray. I wish the Reformers had taught us more about prayer. I think maybe the baby got tossed out with the bathwater. And the neglect of the great medieval teaching on contemplative prayer is something that I think Protestants need to be reclaiming and re-understanding and entering into as a part of our practice. Contemplative prayer, silencing our chattering minds every day. There are techniques around that lead us to this, that we grow into. But I, again, wish that the Reformers had taught us a bit more about prayer than I think they have. And I need the teaching. I need that in this life that I'm living now. I need the teaching of the great prayer tradition of the church, and maybe it is pre-Reformation that we must turn to. I know I'm out on a limb there a little bit, but this is an exploration that is really big for me at the moment. I know that Becky and Lee are experts at this and teachers of this, and really in an exploration in our own lives with it. It's something perhaps we ought to do in our adult education along the ways, learn more about what prayer is all about, how we silence ourselves in the presence of God and welcome this loving God into our space. So, two more, I think here. The mystery of Christ at the table. I wish we were better at the Eucharist. Okay, I hope this is not too critical, but Sharon and I attended Grandparents' Day with our grandson Elliot at what's the name of the school? Mayfield School, which is a Catholic school, and at Grandparents' Day they said the Mass for all the grandparents, and then the kids sit with us, and our kids are Protestants. Elliot is a Protestant, and we, by the way, we would go up to the altar with the communion, and it rubbed against me that I had to identify myself as non-Catholic and therefore could not receive the elements. That's not Reformed, I'll tell you. I mean, that's part of what the whole Reformation was all about, was exploding that prohibition. And so, okay, that teed me off, but But watching the preparation of the elements and the great reverence that goes into the preparation of the elements, the reciting of ancient liturgical language around that, I think that there's a reverence that Catholics bring to the Eucharist that we have lost. And I don't know what to do about that. That's settled in. It is the way we do things. Pope John Paul II said, at the altar, at the communion table, at the Eucharist, we encounter the mystery of Christ. Always loved that. I mean, the mystery of Christ, he would say. And I think that's absolutely the case, and I think sometimes we sell it short. We don't rise to the mystery of Christ in the presence because the Reformers fought so much over this issue. I mean, was it really Christ? Were the elements really the body of Jesus? I don't think I have to settle that one. Of course, I don't. As a Protestant, I don't believe it. And yet, the mystery of Christ, can it still be there? Absolutely, it can. And I think that's what we should rise to. Okay. I think the unity of believers. I wish the Reformers had thought more and taught us more about Christian unity, the coming together in community. We were working at that at the beer garden, by the way, and we work on it in the courtyard. We work on it as we come to worship every week. Of course, we do have an element of community, but I think we should work on it bigger, more, or something. I don't know. I think, there's all this splintering and splitting that Protestants are famous for. That's not good. Can we come together? Can we believe in each other? Can we love each other? Can we absolutely we must. If you look at Paul's teaching on the unity of believers, it is so strong. We're just blinded to those things when we don't pay enough attention to community, how to gather around meals, how to gather around Bible studies, how to be together somehow, nourishing each other's lives, giving to others, receiving from others, all of that. I think the notion of community is something that the Protestant church needs a bit more work on. Some of you may have heard about the Benedict option, which is an idea that's floating around big time. And a wonderful kind of odd character, Rod Dreher, is driving all of this. It's really worth looking into. He essentially says we need to go back to the kind of structuring of community within our own communities that St. Benedict in the 6th century was of course promoting when he founded the Benedictine monasteries. So to take some of the teachings of the monastic movement and apply it to our own lives now, that's what the Benedict option is all about. I think it's too separatist. That's my reading, but nevertheless, it's out there, and I think it's responding to some of the feeling we have that we don't have enough community among us. So, last question, last thought, and finally, is the Reformation still alive today? Are we in need of a new Reformation? Do we need renewal in the church, in our society? If so, to all of that, what would it take? So what do you think about that? I mean, of course we need spiritual renewal in our world, don't we? You look at these shootings that happen, and there's no. This is evil in the human heart, and it's unexplainable, unfathomable. Yet at the same time, what has a decidedly secular culture and the secularizing of culture allowed for us to generate in our own hearts something like that? I think we need spiritual renewal. I would revel to see it happening. I think what we probably need to do is we need to watch where it is happening and lift it up and say, it's great. And of course the church, as you all know, is spreading explosively all over the world. You see decline in Europe and you see decline in America, but in the what is called the global South, I mean, it is booming, flourishing. By the way, a lot of it on Reformation kind of stuff, teaching, preaching from the Scriptures, empowering people to read the Scriptures, the notion of grace instead of works. All of that, I think, is happening, and so we need to focus on that and say, yes, renewal is possible. What would renewal look like in our own society? It's worth thinking about. I think about it a lot. We used to have a vision statement which I helped to craft at Seattle Pacific, saying we will engage the culture and change the world. And the whole notion was we have something to offer as Christians into a hurting world. We have a great deal to offer. It is and it is connected with this grace of a lavishly loving God. We've got that to present to the world, don't we? And how can we do that better? How can we present it to our friends around us? We had some folks over for wine and cheese last night, our neighbors, and wonderful people. But I was sitting there thinking, here I'm going to do all of this stuff tomorrow, and they are just in a very, totally different world. Now, I don't think we are as human beings. I think as human beings, we're all, if we'd ever be able to talk in a group like that, we'd discover that we've all got basic human needs. And of course, then what we have to offer is a gospel that say this is a response to those needs. And so I think that it would be great for us all to think about how can renewal happen. Think about it for our own church. Think about it for our neighborhood. Think about it for our world. I know it's a big topic, and everybody, myself included, you sort of tune out and say, I can't do anything about all of that. Well, maybe it's praying for it. Some renewal needs to happen. I feel a longing within our culture, a yearning for something more, and yet we are so secularized that the immediate answer is can't do it, can't go there. It's not a spiritual solution. And we find all kinds of it. That's why I think we have this obsessive focus on politics. Somebody solve our problems, will you? And I think that's misguided ultimately. I think it's, and of course we need our politicians. We need to support them and we need to let them know what we think and all of that. But this obsessive focus on politics probably means that the church is no longer fulfilling the need that people have, that there are some answers to something better and something more and something that is more whole and more fulfilling than it is. Well, those are my thoughts. I thought maybe we would finish with the great Ray Charles singing Amazing Grace. Now, I know Amazing Grace comes out of, what are the dates on it? Much later than the Reformation time. It's the 19th century, right? Oh, you got to reset it. Okay, Brandon, that's great. And by the way, as I was looking for this, we could have gone to Johnny Cash, Elvis Presley, and especially Aretha Franklin for wonderful renditions out of the gospel, great gospel tradition, singing Amazing Grace. So I just ask us and say to us, grace is the heart of the matter, I think. I think that's what all this teaching is all about. I think that's what this great movement is all about. So listen to Ray Charles. Sing along if you want to, but to listen to Ray Charles lead us in the notion that it is amazing grace. Once I was blind. He's blind, by the way, which is just a real wonderful part of listening to Ray Charles sing. But once I was blind and now I see. I am accepted. Yes, right? So that's what the message is. All right, let's run it, huh?
a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Said I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see.
Amen. He's singing, by the way, with a London Philharmonic. I tried to find him opening with his extraordinarily wonderful gospel piano, but I couldn't find a rendition on YouTube that did it. So this one was repeated over and over and over again on YouTube, so people must like it, but I wanted that gospel piano, just let him rip a little bit. But it was beautiful, his voice, and he always sings with such wonderful presence with his music, I think, and amazing grace. Amazing grace, and it runs through our lives, runs through history. It was explosive at a moment in time in the Reformation moment, and continues on to this very day. So God bless you all. Thanks for being here. And hey, next week we'll talk about Hilary Mantel and the extraordinary English Reformation. So thanks for coming.